Welcome to another episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast. I'm your host Daniel Watkins, and on today's episode of the podcast, we'll be going back in time to the medieval period as I speak with the Company of Artisans. Regular visitors to Alnwick Castle might have met the Company of Artisans demonstrating various skills and crafts from the Middle Ages. We'll be focusing on one in particular, the art of medieval tile making. I spoke with Karen from the Company of Artisans about what it takes to make medieval tiles, what they can tell us about that period in history, and what it's like taking on a role of a medieval artisan somewhere like Alnwick Castle. It's a really interesting conversation, and here it is. Hope you enjoy it. My guest on the Alnwick Castle podcast today is Karen Slade from the Company of Artisans. How are you today?
I'm very well, Daniel, thank you.
So you are one of our regular external performers here at Alnwick Castle. Let's find out first of all a little bit about you and what the Company of Artisans do. Tell us about Kate Tyler.
Oh, Kate Tyler. Kate Tyler is my alter ego. I've been making medieval tiles since 1996, which I know is 25 years and a bit. So I think it's 26 years this year. And Company of Artisans is myself and my husband Charlie. So we demonstrate historic crafts, mainly historic building crafts, because Charlie is a building conservator. So we, as part of our job, we dress up in medieval clothes or Tudor clothes, and we work at public events and we teach historic crafts. But all of that is fed into by the real life jobs that we also do, which is we repair historic fabric on historic buildings. And I make medieval floor tiles. I make replica medieval floor tiles. So it started as a hobby for me, and I worked as Kate Tyler for about 15 years. And then I met Charlie, and I started doing building conservation with him. So we work for properties like the National Trust. We blend that with working for people like English Heritage and demonstrating things like historic brickwork and plaster, stone carving, and I make a lot of medieval floor tiles up and down the country. So yeah, that's what I do.
People probably don't think about tiles when they think about the medieval period, but what's so fascinating about floor tiles? What can they tell us?
Well, I research the real tiles, so I find examples very often in collections, sometimes small museums, but there's a very large collection held by the British Museum. They've got about 13,000 medieval floor tiles. And I research using archaeology catalogues. So when people have done digs and they found medieval tiles, they record them, they do little drawings. But I'm lucky enough very often to work with people who have their own collections. So I do a lot of work for people like Norton Priory in Cheshire. And there I get to visit their stores, I get to rummage through their originals, and I get to examine them and look at how they were made, look at the patterns. And I recreate those, I carve wood blocks and I press those into clay, and I fill that with another colour clay, white clay, and I scrape away that pattern until you can see the likeness, and then I glaze them and fire them until you end up with basically what it would have looked like on day one that it was made, not like they very often look like now, which is where they've been walked on for hundreds of years and the pattern is really eroded, or they're little tiny broken fragments that have been washed up on the foreshore of the Thames, because they're very often found there by mudlarks. And sometimes they're where they've found a medieval tile kiln. So they are like at Norton Priory, where there are fragments that were wasters. So they're ones that were never walked on, but they're broken pieces. So I pull together information from all of these different sources, and I then recreate them. And I demonstrate that because making them by myself in my workshop is actually really boring when I'm doing it by myself. And I love working with the public, talking to ordinary people who've never seen a medieval tile before, or people who are archaeologists. Sometimes they're hobbyists, sometimes they're archaeology students, and they all bring to me that sometimes they ask me questions and they get me to look at them in a way that I've never thought about before. Or sometimes they are people with their own experience, their own background in any walk of life, that can then because they either ask me a question or they have an insight into something that I'm merrily talking about and never thought about that aspect of it before. So I learn a lot about what's going on a picture, on an image of a medieval tile, from people who are students of heraldry. They've got masses to tell me, because heraldry is such a huge subject and I know very little about it. I only know it as it relates to tile patterns, which is tiny. But so, for instance, I had a tile from Canterbury Cathedral. I was contacted in 2015 where they'd uncovered a medieval tile floor they weren't expecting to find in the cloister at Canterbury Cathedral. And out of the patterns, most of them are plain, some of them are beautiful fleur-de-lis, little lily flowers, and then one pattern on the corner of this test pit they dug was a picture of a pilgrim, and he was a pilgrim bent over making his way to see Thomas Becket's tomb at Canterbury Cathedral. And I made a copy of that tile for them because they had to cover it all up again. They had to leave it there. So I made them a copy of the tile so they could show people, this is what's underneath here, but we can't dig it up. And I then made a copy for myself to show to the public and talk about. And I met a lady, I was demonstrating at Mary Arden's farm, which is part of Shakespeare's birthplace. Mary Arden was Shakespeare's mother. So it's a farm and it's lived in by reenactors, and they've got little farm animals and things. It's ever so cute. And I was demonstrating there in 2018, and it was early on a Sunday morning, and I just made my own copy of this pilgrim tile and was talking about it and explaining what I knew about it. And there was a visitor. She was a doctor of osteopathy. And I found that out because she said, well, he's not just a pilgrim making his way to Becket's tomb. He's actually going to Becket's tomb for healing. So I said, oh, okay, how do you know that? And she said, well, the position that he's in, the bent over posture that he's got, is specific to a condition. It's a condition where the vertebrae of the spine fuse together. And it's something that you see in people that have TB. It's a condition where TB is untreated. She, as a medical doctor, had treated people with this condition in India. And it's something that as a GP in Britain, you would never see. You wouldn't see that in modern times. But in the medieval period, it was very, very common. If you survive TB long enough, then you do develop this condition of the spine. And so this is what's portrayed on this tile. And I would never, ever have learned that if I had been there on that day talking to this doctor and she happened to come across me and was able to share her knowledge. So that's one of the things that I just absolutely love about demonstrating, in particular medieval tiles, is it gives you a connection with people because they're really tactile, they're really accessible, and it gives me this like window into medieval life and that particular aspect of medieval history. And because I can speak to people and then listen to what they've got to tell me when I let them get a word in edgeways, I learn all these insights, which is, I think, I'm in a unique position to sort of gather this information.
A little bit detective, a little bit teacher, a little bit creative.
Yeah, that's it. It keeps all the plates spinning. I love the fact that it's an art, it's a craft, it's an insight into political history as well, because there's other aspects of when tiles are being made. They were popularly made, the square ones with the patterns in that everybody recognises as medieval tiles, they were made from around 1240 through to about 1540. So that's 300 years of history. For instance, at Alnwick, the Percy family here, they've got their own family crest on tiles, on a set of 4 tiles. And you can still see 2 of these in situ at Byland Abbey. So if you visit Byland Abbey as a tourist, as a visitor, you can still see in the cloister, uncovered for everyone to see, there are 2 tiles with parts of the Percy family coats of arms, and they were commissioned in 1513. And we know that specifically. It's a very, very specific date. There isn't anything that I've found written down about them having commissioned the tiles, but there is a bishop called Bishop Huby, who we know got his bishopship at Byland Abbey in 1513, and his tiles are almost identical to the Percy family tiles. So we know the tile makers were working on those particular patterns in 1513.
So we have got some surviving examples of medieval tiles that are connected to Alnwick Castle, although not physically here. There's very little medieval Alnwick Castle that's still left, especially when it comes to tiles and things like that.
There is, yes. There are fragments. There are still aspects. When we demonstrate medieval building crafts here at Alnwick, Charlie has his stone demonstration looking at how stone masonry was done, and we're using tools that are identical to the tools that the current modern masons who are still working here, they recognise them. They could literally walk into our medieval stonemasons workshop, pick up a tool and start working. There is no difference, for 800 years they're still using the same tools, and they're working stone. They recognise exactly how the methods are used, and they're stacking the stones exactly the same way, using the same mortar, and the only difference is they've got an electric winch on their scaffolding, on their modern scaffolding, to haul up the big blocks of stone. We've got a wooden, a scale replica medieval crane that we use with a winch, and our winch has a little rope over it, and we use a much more medieval set of tools to lift, and it's just by winding a handle. So yeah, the modern masons don't wind their windlasses in the same way that we do, but otherwise it's identical.
Yeah, I think it would take a lot longer without that electric assistance.
It would.
So we know about the tools, we know about the methods, and we know about the products. What do we know about the people? What do we know about the medieval tilers and masons? Are they people that have records to tell us about in any individuals?
Yes, they do. There's a wonderful set of books that was published in the 1960s, called The King's Works, and it's a set of books. I think it's a set of 7 published books, and it's all of the financial records for all of the buildings that were commissioned by the kings and queens of England, that go all the way back to sort of the 800s and right the way up to modern times. And these records are for individual masons, individual labourers, and the clerks of works. And one of the clerks of works that's recorded there that worked on the king's palaces is Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales. So he's down in these clerks of works books, and all the records, his financial records are there for the buildings that he was responsible for while he was the clerk of works for the king. So he's one of the most famous clerks of works that's recorded down there in these records. But yes, there are records surviving for tile makers being paid by the thousand for selling tiled floors, again as part of the king's works, but also for sort of abbeys and churches. There are surviving records. One of the records is for a Catherine Lightfoot, who's paid for several thousand tiles for one of the abbeys, and it's not known whether she was a middlewoman, whether she was actually a tile maker, or whether she was actually a merchant that was buying these tiles directly from tile makers and selling them on. But she's down as having received several payments actually, and her husband, we think it was her husband. There's also a Mr. Lightfoot who appears in the records, but we're not sure whether that was her father or whether that was her husband, because medieval women could inherit their husband's businesses if they were widowed. As long as they didn't marry again, they could carry on working and employing all the same people and running the business as their husband. And they would have been involved, they would have been involved in the financial part of the business as well.
These were things that you would order in their thousands.
Yes.
You'd need quite a lot of tiles for a cathedral or an abbey, I would imagine.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. I'm currently working on a small section of pavement for Chester Museum, which is then going to transfer to Chester Cathedral. This is for an exhibition that they're doing, and they asked me for 30 tiles, and I made it up into 32 because 32 gives you 2 panels of 16. So two squares of 16, and tiles are very often made in patterns which are sort of sets of 4, sets of 9, or sets of 16. So 16 is a middle set of 4 and then an edge round it. And so 2 sets of 16 gives you 32. And this 12 centimetre tile, by the time you got the grout in, it's 50 centimetres by a metre. So it's only half a square metre, it's 32. So 64 tiles gives you a square metre. And that doesn't cover a lot. A square metre of floor doesn't cover a lot of area. So yeah, you're talking thousands. And people would have little chapels with their family coats of arms around. So if they had a tomb chest, they knew they were going to be buried in a tomb chest in a chapel as part of and they might even have their own family altar. They would have a floor made to go around that tomb. So they didn't have to have thousands and thousands. But when you look at something the size of, say, Byland Abbey was having tiled floors laid. We know from around 1210, so the very early tiles were mosaic floors, and they were little tiny cut pieces where you have these circular patterns and they radiate out, and every single individual piece of that floor has to be made and fit into that pattern. It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
A lot of work. So that didn't keep going for very long. They soon ditched that as an idea because you had to have not only skilled tile makers, you had to have tile setters who were really skilled. You couldn't just involve any labourers. You had to have them, specially trained. So then they realised that tiles that were square could be made and laid much more easily. And you could predict how much area you had to fit. So they were no longer making them specific to a particular area.
It becomes mathematical.
It becomes much simpler. And then once you get past the sort of 1240s, 1250s, once you get to the 1270s, you then begin to have ordinary churches then begin to commission tile floors as well. So it begins to filter down from the abbeys, who are the richest, who've got all the money. The less rich churches then begin to have them, and they begin to be more like mass-produced, really.
So they start to become more affordable as well?
Yes, they are. Yeah, they're more affordable and they become less specific to the place as well. So you get tilers working who are known as the Westminster tilers because they did make tiles for Westminster Abbey, but you get this particular style of tile that filters down into ordinary churches around the Westminster area and into Kent. You get tilers working in Penn in Buckinghamshire, and they're beautiful tiles, but they are mass-produced. They're stamped. They're not particularly well scraped. And then you get some really quite ropey tiles that are sort of beginning to be blurred as they're scraped. They're not particularly well made, and the patterns aren't particularly crisp and not particularly well carved. And then you get the Black Death, and then the Black Death hits, and you get this sort of hiatus, you get this interruption for about sort of 10, 20 years. And then you begin to get more tiles from the 1370s, a few in the 1400s, not very many. And then you get this other sort of revival almost in the early Tudor period, which is when the Percy tiles are made, where you have tiles. I think that tiled floors are beginning to become worn out by this period, and so you're getting then a second or a third layer of tile being laid down. So the 1500 tiles, they're quite sophisticated. They're beginning to play with the fact that you've only got these two colours. So they're getting very geometric, very complex. And then you have the Reformation. And the Reformation, Henry VIII, changes the country's religion, changes the fashion as well. And you begin to get tiles coming over from Holland, from the Netherlands, which are beautiful colours. You get these beautiful coloured tiles coming in, these Delft tiles, Majolica tiles, which are painted.
Is this where the blue and white starts to come in?
That's it. You start to get blue and white, blue and red, blue and green, and you get floors like the one at the Vine, which is in Hampshire, owned by the National Trust. There's a chapel there in the Vine, which is full of these beautiful painted portraits. Again, still little square tiles, but they're colour. Beautiful coloured tiles. You even get portraits of tortoises on them. Wow. There's a tortoise on the tiles. And so all of a sudden, people are bored of having these two coloured brown and yellow tiles. They don't want brown and yellow tiles. They want these beautiful full colour. It's like having black and white telly. Yeah. After you've seen colour telly, you can't go back to watching snooker in black and white again. It's just not fashionable. So the abbeys are closing. All of a sudden, you don't have to pay tilers to make tiles because you can go and you can literally dig them up from abbey floors. You've got second-hand medieval tiles that are being sold. So you get merchants and private houses. You get churches that are reusing tiles from abbeys. And you get one workshop in Barnstaple in Devon. They're still making the tiles and they're still sending them across to Ireland. They're shipping them across to Ireland with all the Elizabeth I taking over Irish lands and putting her people in. They're building churches, they're commissioning tiles in Ireland. But other than that, it begins to it fades away.
Until several hundred years later, we come to you, helping to recreate some of these.
Well, you get the Victorians in the middle. I can't take all the credit. The Victorians, the Victorians, you have William Godwin. William Godwin was the first person really to start to remake medieval tiles and to put them into churches. And he was lovely. I do love William Godwin because he was making them what I think of as the proper way. He was making them with wet clay and slip, and they look very medieval, and they're beautiful. And then that gets taken up and it gets industrialised, and you get Pugin and you get Craven Dunhill, and you get all the really very, you get people like the ones who are Pugin laying the floors at Parliament, where you get the Houses of Parliament tile floors. Those are now just being replaced, and Craven Dunhill, who've got all the patterns from the original moulds that were used, they've just remade all the floors in the Houses of Parliament with the original patterns that were used in the 1800s, which is just amazing. So yeah, you get a few Victorians, you get a few thousand Victorian tiles being made and hall floors and things like that being made. But there were medieval replica tiles being made by there's a wonderful tile maker called Diana Hall, and she works down in Dorset. She was working with Elizabeth Eames, and Elizabeth Eames created the catalogue for the medieval tile collection at the British Museum. So Diana Hall was working with Elizabeth Eames. Diana Hall was a conservator. She was conserving the tiles and learning about the fabric of the tiles. And her thing is clay. So she was remarkable. She was going out and finding the original clay beds that the medieval tiles were being made from back in, 700 years ago, to remake tiles like the ones at Winchester Cathedral. So when you go to Winchester Cathedral, you've got all the beautiful medieval tile floors, and in amongst them are what look like these incredibly bright, vivid, almost 1970s looking funky tiles. And those are Diana Hall's, and they're made with the clay that was dug from the same clay beds. She's using lead oxide glazes, galena glazes, and they're extraordinary. So she was making those in the 1970s, 1980s. She's still going. She's still making tiles. She's amazing. She's a member of the Tile and Architectural Ceramics Society, TAX, along with the chair, who's Hans van Leeuwen, who wrote a book on medieval tiles. He wrote the Shire publication on medieval tiles. So they're still going strong, the two of them. And there are a few other people like myself who make medieval tiles, but I think I straddle more of the sort of research camp than most of the other tile makers out there. Most of the other tile makers are potters as well. I'm the only one really who just does tiles, and I'm really the only one who does the level of research that I do. I'm the nerdiest, really, of the tile makers, because I will pursue a tile, to the poor Charlie, he's followed me to random churches in the middle of nowhere just so that I can see a tile. I have driven many, many miles to just see one individual very worn tile so that I can prove whether or not it's the same as the one that I've got in the book. So yeah, we did that recently. We did that in February. We went to see a random church in Leicestershire, because I just had to see if this tile was anything like I thought it was, and it wasn't, but I needed to disprove it, so yeah.
Yeah, I think being the nerdiest tile maker is a good accolade to have.
It's a good t-shirt to have, isn't it? Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Is that how you got into it? Was it through researching and you discovered this world of tiles? How did it start?
It started because I started doing living history. I started doing reenactment in 1988 at Kentwell Hall in Suffolk as a Tudor. And because I up until then, I'd done 3 years as an illustrator, training to be an illustrator at Brighton Poly. And my final year at Brighton, I had some friends. They'd taken part the year before, and I thought they were acting, because one of them was being a player, and so I thought they were putting on a community play. And I happened to have dinner with them, and they were filling in their forms to go back again. And they said, "Oh, you could do this, you could come." And they thought, "Oh, you could be an illuminator, you could come and be a painter, miniature painter." So that's what I did. So my first year, I sat and I painted little portraits on vellum of the gentry who were taking part, playing roles of gentry. And I painted a portrait a day and gave it to them. And I had 10 days, but the people that I became really good friends with were outside in the mud. So I was dressed up as a gentry lady, because you have to be a very high-class lady to do painting in those days. But the friends were outside in the mud, firing wood-fired kilns in the pottery there. And they're very generous, and they let anybody come and help fire the kilns. You don't have to be a potter, you don't have to know anything at all about kiln firing. And so I spent the next few years going and taking part and doing different things, but helping to fire the kilns every time I went. And so I bought the book called English Tilers, published by Elizabeth Eames. There's a series called Medieval Craftsmen published by the British Museum in 1996. And my friend Phoebe and I, her Kentwell name's Phoebe and my Kentwell name's Kate Tyler, we both bought this book and we thought, well, how hard can it be? So I was very lucky because I knew absolutely nothing about clay, about tile making. The only thing I knew about was carving because I was a lino cut illustrator and I had a whole set of little tools to carve lino with. So I thought, well, how hard can it be? You know, carving wood, it can't be that much different than carving lino. So I carved one wood block with a Tudor pattern, a Tudor fleur-de-lis from Hales Abbey. And I rocked up with this one tile pattern, and Phoebe turned up with, I think, a hare on a tile. And we spent 10 days making tiles. And my friend Jack, who comes to Alnwick as the alchemist here, my friend Jack, thankfully, was a professional wood-fired potter. He'd been a wood-fired potter for like 30 years. And so he knew far more about all of this than we did. And he was there throwing pots. And so that summer, first day, we were there. And the book said that tilers would line their moulds with very much like brickmakers do, which is where you have a wet mould and you throw sand into the mould once you've wet it, and then you hurl your clay in from a height to get rid of all the air bubbles. And then you make your tile and you turn it out. Well, of course, all of our tiles were then covered in sand, which is a terrible surface to glaze. It looked like glazed sandpaper. And so Jack was going backwards and forwards that first day, looking across at us and saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? And we're saying, you know nothing about tiles. Get back to your pots. You don't know what you're talking about. We're tilers. You get back to your pots. And he's saying, you don't want to be using sand. You want to be using wood ash to dust your moulds with. You don't want to be wetting your mould. You want to be using wood ash and dusting a dry mould. And we said, look, we've been doing this, man and boy, you know, because we had to pretend. It's all first person. You have to pretend you know what you're doing. So we waited until everyone had gone home that night. And then we snuck off to the kitchens for the wood fire. And we came back with a whole pot full of ash. And day 2, we were there merrily dusting, using a bit of Hessian to dust this wood ash in to line our moulds with, that we were then pressing the clay into. And so from day 2, we knew what we were doing a bit better. So we made about 40 tiles that first year, and they all worked brilliantly, which was amazing, given that we didn't know what we were doing. And the second summer, we made about 140 and we fired a whole kiln full. And then by that stage, I'd carved another couple of patterns and I had a hound and I had another different fleur-de-lis. And then in 2000, I was asked by a friend of mine who was running like a community archaeology day if I would bring all my pattern blocks and my moulds and everything and have a go with the public. And I met somebody there who said, oh, I've got an agent and they're looking for people like you to demonstrate historic crafts. So I said, oh, okay. You know, so that was the beginning of me doing it as a profession, doing it for a living. And my research consisted of, I read the book, English Tilers, cover to cover. I got the British Museum catalogue, which is a massive, massive book. It's 2 books. One's just pictures, and the other is just every individual tile, all 13,500, written about, described.
It sounds like a big book.
It's a very big book. And I used to borrow this once a year from the British Library. I would borrow this book because it costs an awful lot of money. And there were never any copies for sale. So I would borrow this book every year, once a year, and have it out for as long as I possibly could, and then let it go, wave it goodbye, and then wait until I could borrow it again. And then finally, I did find a copy for sale on eBay, and I bought it on eBay, and it was a fortune. But now they started digitising all of the collection, and now the British Museum collection's online. You can type in medieval tile, and you'll return 13,500 results. And so if you want to be a little bit more specific, you could type in, say, Percy family to see if you can find the Percy families. You could type in Byland Abbey to find Byland Abbey tiles. You can search by image, you can search by collection, you can search by area and place. So you can search by sort of places that these have been found. So yeah, I did go and visit my local collection because I was living in Nottingham at the time. So I went to the Brewhouse Yard Museum and looked and asked to see their collection, let's access their stores. So that's something that I do quite often is go and visit where all the local archaeology has been stored and put in reserve collection. So I do that quite a lot.
So for 13 years, you've been coming to Alnwick Castle, teaching our teams the craft required and the skills and the history behind all of this, and then that gets transferred onto the public all year round, but especially when the Company of Artisans come to come to stay for a little bit. And what do people get to find out about if they come and talk to you at the castle specifically?
They get to make their own mini tile, because it's one of the things that I developed when I was demonstrating. Because when you make a medieval tile, you stamp it into red clay, really dark brown clay that stains your hands, and it weighs about 1 kilo when it's freshly made. And then you fill it with this white clay slip, which is very wet. It's like a thick cream. And so when I first started demonstrating, I make these with people help me make them, but then I would find that children in particular would want to take them away, and they're really impractical to take away when they're freshly made. It's basically like taking 1 kilo of solid wet clay topped with like pancake mix. It's really not attractive, and you can't do anything with it, unless you've got a kiln at home and you know how to process it. So I thought I really need to have something that they can take home. So I got air dry clay, which is just stoneware clay with little tiny fibres in it that knit together, which mean that when it breaks, it doesn't fall to pieces. And because the earliest tiles were mosaic shapes, I thought, okay, how can we make mosaic shape mini tiles? And so we buy little biscuit cutters, cookie cutters, metal shapes, and they were all different shapes, these miniature mosaics. And then I carve into wet clay, I carve miniature versions of the tile patterns. And what I like to do is, a tile pattern is often made up of many different elements. So it'll have, a little bit of a flower, perhaps a little animal, little corners that are different. And so what I do is I take those little individual pieces of pattern and I carve them into clay, fire those so they're hard fired, but they stand up so then people can use them to press into clay, and they each make their own individual tile, so it's unique to them. So when I make my tile, I carve all the pattern in one square block, and that pattern has to stay the same. It has to be the same tile, day in, day out. That's what I want, is for it to stay the same. But every tile that the visitors come and make, even now, I've been doing it for 26 years, even now, I will still get visitors that come here to Alnwick. They have little sticks that they can draw in as well and draw their own designs in as well. And I will get visitors make a unique tile that I have never seen a combination. They will take a little pattern, perhaps of a flower, and they'll turn that into something that is just unique and beautiful. And very often I will stop everybody else and I'll embarrass them totally, because I'll just say, look, this is just so beautiful. I've just got to show everybody, because, the creativity that people exhibit, and often they're on holiday, they're soft, we've had visitors from Australia, we have visitors from China, and they're like, okay, I'm going to try and get it home in my luggage, and we very often have visitors who've come in camper vans, they're on holiday for a week, in a camper van. And I say, and you can paint it when it's dry, you can colour it in with any colours at all, they don't have to be my yellow and brown colours. And they're looking at me as if to say, thank you so much, because this is, and especially if it's raining and they've got a really rainy week and they know this is like Monday and they've got the whole week and they're like, and the forecast is dreadful, and they're like, thank you. So yeah, it's fabulous, because it's hands-on, it's touching a little bit of history, and it's just putting it into context, the stuff that's usually behind glass cabinets, that you're not allowed to touch. This is a way of interpreting it in such a way that it makes it real, it makes it tactile.
Yeah, it's not just something you walk on.
No, it's not just something you walk on, it's something from a distance. You've made it real. And because all the patterns have a meaning, all the patterns have a symbolism. Sometimes it's numbers, sometimes it's what the animals mean, so it's like the symbols, sometimes it's heraldry. Sometimes somebody will come and they'll say, oh, that was our school badge. And they can tell me, what the meaning is. I've had that a couple of times being here. I've had people come up and say, oh, we had a school badge with that on, And so that's, I'll try and store that away. Sometimes I have to go and find a paper bag to write it down on, because I can't remember. But yeah, very often it's something that somebody's familiar with from another part of the country, not local.
Connections in all sorts of different unexpected ways.
That's it. Yeah, that's it, exactly.
And you'll be here this summer with the Company of Artisans, demonstrating all sorts of historical things, from non-electrical winch systems for construction through to tile making, through even to a little bit of alchemy as well. And yeah, we hope to have the alchemist himself on the podcast in the future. In the meantime, where can people find Company of Artisans online?
We have a website and we have a Facebook page. I update the Facebook page far more than the website, because I've still got to remember how to use that. But we are companyofartisans.co.uk, and we are Company of Artisans on Facebook and Twitter.
And alnwickcastle.com will give all the dates of when you're appearing. But for now, Karen Slade, thank you very much for joining us on the Alnwick Castle podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Daniel.
If you'd like to see the Company of Artisans, they appear regularly throughout Alnwick Castle's opening season. Please check alnwickcastle.com for full details and dates. If you'd like a go at making your own medieval tile, this craft is available daily from the Artisans Courtyard. If you enjoyed this episode of the Alnwick Castle podcast, please subscribe, share it with your friends, leave us a rating or review, and let us know on Twitter at Alnwick Castle or by emailing podcast@alnwickcastle.com. Join us again in 2 weeks for another episode, but until then, thank you very much for listening. I've been Daniel, and goodbye.